The vampire king had been her favorite patient, silent, still, requiring only wound care that never seemed to heal completely. Until the night she accidentally nicked her finger on his IV stand, and a single drop of blood hit his lips. His eyes snapped open for the first time in years, locking onto hers with an ancient hunger that made her realize why his chart had no admission date. Elena Rivera's sneakers whispered against the polished linoleum as she badged into the restricted wing of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, the familiar weight of her nursing bag pulling at her shoulder. The October night pressed against the reinforced windows, and something in the air felt different tonight, charged like the moments before lightning strikes. She paused at the nurse's station, checking the electronic chart that never seemed to update properly for room 237, then moved down the dimly lit corridor where fluorescent bulbs hummed their mechanical lullaby. 4 years she had walked this same path. 4 years of tending to the man who had no name, no history, no visitors. The other nurses called him John Doe, but Elena had stopped thinking of him that way long ago. To her, he was simply her patient, the one who needed her most. The automatic doors to his room slid open with their familiar hiss, and she stepped inside to find him exactly as she always did, pale and still beneath crisp white sheets, his breathing so shallow it barely moved his chest. Tonight the shadows seemed deeper, pooling in the corners of the room like spilled ink, and the machines that monitored his vitals cast dancing patterns of green and red light across his sharp features. Elena set down her bag and moved through her ritual with practiced efficiency, checking his IV lines, adjusting his pillow, running her fingers along his pulse point where his skin felt cool as marble. She had done this thousands of times, this careful choreography of care, speaking to him in soft tones about her day, the weather, the small dramas that played out in the hospital corridors. The doctor said comatose patients could sometimes hear, could sometimes understand, so Elena talked to him as if he were awake, as if he might suddenly open those dark eyes and answer her back. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. She told him about Mrs. Chen in 314 who had finally gone home after her hip surgery, about the new intern who kept mixing up the medication charts, about the stray cat that had taken up residence in the parking lot, and how the night security guard had started leaving out food. His wounds required fresh dressings every 12 hours, strange lacerations that ran along his forearms and chest, wounds that never quite healed but never seemed to worsen either. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, had explained it as some rare circulation disorder, but Elena had noticed things over the years that didn't match any medical textbook. The wounds never bled when she cleaned them, never showed signs of infection despite their refusal to close, and sometimes she could swear they looked fresher in the morning than they had the night before. She prepared the sterile gauze and antiseptic solution, her movements automatic after so many repetitions, and began unwrapping the bandages from his left arm. The skin beneath was pale as moonlight, marked by those peculiar lacerations that formed intricate patterns she had memorized but never understood. Tonight her hands felt clumsy, distracted by the strange energy that seemed to thrum through the building, and as she reached for a fresh roll of medical tape, her finger caught on the sharp edge of his IV stand. The metal bit deep, drawing a bright line of blood that welled up immediately. Elena muttered a quiet curse and turned toward the sink to clean the cut, but froze when she heard the machines around her begin to malfunction. The heart monitor flatlined, then spiked, then began showing readings that made no medical sense. The IV pump started beeping frantically, and the overhead lights flickered like dying stars. She spun back toward the bed just as a single drop of her blood, crimson and warm, fell from her injured finger and landed squarely on his pale lips. The effect was immediate and impossible. His eyes snapped open, not the slow, confused awakening of someone emerging from unconsciousness, but the sharp, predatory focus of something that had been awake all along. Those eyes were darker than she remembered from her glimpses during routine care, black as winter nights, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. The machines continued their electronic symphony of distress as he sat up in one fluid motion, moving with a grace that spoke of perfect health rather than years of immobility. Elena stepped backward, her hand still bleeding, her mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. He should have been weak, disoriented, confused. Instead, he moved like liquid shadow, his attention focused entirely on her, as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. When he spoke, his voice was like velvet wrapped around steel, cultured and precise, with just the hint of an accent she couldn't place. He said her name, Elena, and the sound of it on his lips made her realize that her entire world had been built on a foundation of lies. She pressed herself against the wall, medical training warring with instinct, and watched as he swung his legs over the side of the bed with perfect coordination. The hospital gown fell away from shoulders that were broader than she had realized, revealing skin that was unmarked by the scars or muscle wasting that should have accompanied years of bed rest. He stood slowly, as if savoring the movement, and Elena noticed for the first time that his reflection was missing from the metal surfaces that surrounded them. The IV pole and heart monitor showing only empty air where he should have been. The shadows in the room seemed to bend toward him, pooling at his feet like loyal servants, and when he smiled, she caught a glimpse of teeth that were too sharp, too white, too perfect for any human mouth. Her mind cataloged details she had somehow missed over 4 years of intimate care. The way his skin never showed pressure sores despite his supposed immobility, how his muscle tone remained perfect without physical therapy, the absence of any real medical history in his charts. She had attributed these inconsistencies to his mysterious condition, to the experimental treatments Dr. Webb had mentioned, but now she understood that there had never been any condition at all, only a deception so complete it had fooled an entire hospital. He took a step toward her, and Elena found her voice at last, demanding to know who he was, what he was, why he had been pretending. His smile widened, revealing more of those impossibly sharp canines, and he told her his name, Kieran Ashworth. The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it, with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, made her realize she was in the presence of something far more dangerous than any patient she had ever treated. He explained with casual honesty that sent chills down her spine, telling her he was what humans called a vampire, though he preferred older terms, more accurate ones. He was a king, he said, ruler of territories that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Appalachian Mountains, commander of creatures she had thought existed only in movies and nightmares. For 8 centuries he had lived, fought, killed, ruled. But for the past 4 years he had chosen this sanctuary, this sterile room, this careful deception, all for the privilege of her gentle touch. The wounds on his arms and chest, he explained, were self-inflicted, renewed each night after she left, necessary props in the elaborate theater he had constructed around their relationship. He had listened to every word she had ever spoken to him, memorized the cadence of her voice as she described her life, her hopes, her fears about aging parents and student loans, and the small apartment she could barely afford. He knew about her ex-boyfriend Marcus, who had left her for someone younger, about her sister Sophia, who lived in California and called every Sunday, about the garden she tended on her fire escape where she grew herbs for cooking. He had fallen in love, he said, with her compassion, her dedication to caring for someone she believed could never respond, never acknowledge her kindness. In a world where he was surrounded by those who served him out of fear or ambition, she had offered something infinitely more precious, genuine caring, given freely to someone who could offer nothing in return. Elena listened to his confession with growing horror and fascination, understanding finally why no other nurses had been assigned to his case, why Dr. Webb had always handled his care personally, why the restricted wing felt different from the rest of the hospital. She was processing the implications, the danger she might be in, when Kieran stepped closer and reached out to touch her face with fingers that were too cold, too steady. He told her he loved her, that 4 years of feigned unconsciousness had been worth it for the privilege of her touch, her voice, her presence. But even as he spoke, Elena could see the predator beneath the man, could sense the vast power he kept carefully leashed, could imagine the centuries of violence that had brought him to this throne he claimed. The fluorescent lights continued to flicker overhead, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear alarms beginning to sound as the electronic systems throughout the restricted wing responded to whatever energy he was projecting. She realized with crystalline clarity that she was no longer Elena Rivera, night shift nurse, tending to patients who needed her care. She was Elena Rivera, unwitting confidant to the most powerful supernatural being on the East Coast, and nothing in her life would ever be simple again. Elena forced herself to complete her rounds, checking on the other patients in the restricted wing, with hands that trembled despite her efforts to remain calm. Her mind reeling from everything Kieran had revealed while her training demanded she maintain professional composure. The elderly woman in 235 needed her pain medication adjusted. The young man in 239 was running a slight fever that required monitoring. And through it all, Elena moved like an automaton, going through the motions while her thoughts churned with impossible revelations about vampires and kings, and 4 years of carefully constructed deception. When she returned to room 237, Kieran had positioned himself back in the bed, though he remained sitting upright, his dark eyes tracking her every movement as she approached with fresh bandages to replace the ones that had somehow remained pristine despite his earlier activity. He explained in that cultured voice that he would need to return to his feigned unconsciousness before dawn, before the day staff arrived. But first, there were things she needed to understand about the world she had unknowingly entered. Dr. Marcus Webb appeared in the doorway as if summoned, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of strain as he took in the scene before him. Kieran awake and alert, Elena clearly shaken but still standing. Webb closed the door behind him and activated some kind of electronic device that made a soft humming sound, explaining that it would prevent their conversation from being overheard by either human or supernatural surveillance. He had been expecting this moment, he told Elena, had been preparing for it since the night 4 years ago when Kieran had first arrived at the hospital requesting sanctuary under an ancient treaty that most humans knew nothing about. St. Bartholomew's Hospital, Webb revealed, served as neutral ground between the supernatural world and human authorities, a place where creatures like Kieran could exist without fear of persecution, in exchange for protecting the facility from other supernatural threats that might prey on the vulnerable patients within its walls. Several members of the staff were aware of this arrangement, Webb continued, though they had signed agreements that bound them to secrecy through means both legal and supernatural, and Elena's selection for Kieran's care had been far from random. Her rare blood type, O negative with additional markers that appeared in fewer than 1 in 10,000 people, combined with what Webb called natural psychic shielding, had made her the ideal candidate to care for a vampire of Kieran's power without being influenced or harmed by his presence. For 4 years, she had unknowingly served as both caregiver and protection, her unique biology creating a barrier that allowed Kieran to experience genuine human interaction without the compulsions and manipulations that usually accompanied vampire-human contact. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with pale streaks of light that made Kieran wince despite the heavily tinted windows, he warned Elena that their connection had fundamentally changed her status in the supernatural world. No longer was she simply a human with useful biological traits. She was now the woman who had captured the attention of the Vampire King, and that made her a target for every enemy he had accumulated over 8 centuries of rule. He returned to his position of feigned unconsciousness with obvious reluctance, his eyes closing just as the first day shift nurses began their morning routines, but not before pressing something into Elena's hand, a small pendant that felt warm against her palm and pulsed with an energy that made her fingertips tingle. The next evening brought visitors that Elena had not expected, beginning with a woman who introduced herself to the hospital administration as Dr. Victoria Thorne, a specialist in rare neurological conditions who had requested permission to consult on the case of their long-term comatose patient in room 237. Victoria was elegant in the way of expensive things, her dark hair pulled back in a severe chignon, her pale skin perfect as porcelain, her movements precise and controlled as she swept through the restricted wing with the authority of someone accustomed to having doors opened for her. When she encountered Elena during the shift change, her smile was sharp as winter wind, and her eyes held a calculating intelligence that made Elena's skin crawl. Victoria knew exactly who Elena was, knew about the events of the previous night, knew things about Kieran that Elena was only beginning to understand. The ancient laws that governed vampire society, Victoria explained with the patience of a teacher instructing a particularly slow student, were clear and absolute regarding romantic involvement between vampires and humans. Such relationships were forbidden, punishable by exile from vampire society, or, in cases involving vampire nobility, death for both parties involved. Victoria had served on the council that enforced these laws for over 3 centuries, had personally overseen the execution of vampires who had violated the prohibition, had witnessed the horrific deaths of the humans foolish enough to believe that love could transcend the fundamental differences between species. She offered Elena a choice presented with the courtesy of a business transaction. Accept a substantial financial settlement, enough to pay off her student loans, and buy a comfortable house anywhere in the country, in exchange for disappearing from Kieran's life forever and never returning to St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The alternative, Victoria made clear, was to watch Kieran suffer the consequences of their forbidden bond, to see him stripped of his immortality and left vulnerable to the many enemies who had spent centuries planning their revenge against the vampire king. Elena listened to Victoria's ultimatum with growing anger rather than fear, understanding that she was being dismissed as easily disposable, a human whose feelings and choices mattered less than the convenience of vampire politics. Her refusal to accept the offer clearly surprised Victoria, who had expected fear and compliance rather than defiance from a mere mortal. That evening brought another unexpected visitor in the form of Marcus Ashworth, Kieran's brother, who moved through the hospital corridors with the same fluid grace as Kieran, but carried himself with an urgency that spoke of immediate danger. Marcus was younger looking than Kieran, his features softer, his manner less commanding, but his eyes held the same ancient knowledge, and his presence carried the same subtle authority that marked him as vampire nobility. He found Elena in the break room during her dinner hour and explained with brutal honesty that the Vampire Council had already met, had already voted, and had already decided that Elena represented an unacceptable threat to vampire security that needed to be eliminated before their relationship with Kieran could inspire other vampires to seek human connections. The Council's decision was not subject to appeal or negotiation. Elena would die, and if Kieran interfered with their judgment, he would be stripped of his immortality and cast out from vampire society, leaving him vulnerable to every enemy who had ever feared or resented his power. Dr. Webb found them in the break room and revealed another layer of the hospital's secret history, explaining that St. Bartholomew's had served as sanctuary for forbidden supernatural romances before, though the outcomes were invariably tragic. He had documented 17 cases over the past century where supernatural beings had sought refuge within the hospital's walls while pursuing relationships with humans, and in every instance, the supernatural community's laws had eventually claimed both lovers, leaving behind only grief and carefully falsified death certificates. Elena returned to Kieran's room that night with her mind made up despite the warnings and threats she had received, determined to face whatever consequences might come from her refusal to abandon the man she was beginning to love. As she sat beside his bed, speaking to him in whispers while he maintained his facade of unconsciousness, strange dreams began to intrude on her waking thoughts, visions that felt too real to be products of her imagination. She saw glimpses of Kieran's past, centuries of existence that stretched back through time like an unending tapestry of violence and power and loneliness. In these visions, she witnessed his battles against other supernatural creatures, his struggles to maintain order among vampire houses that constantly schemed against each other, his previous attempts at love that had ended in bloodshed and betrayal. The images came to her with increasing frequency and clarity, and she realized that their blood contact had created some kind of psychic bond that allowed her to access his memories, to experience fragments of his long existence as if they were her own. Through these visions, she learned that Kieran had not sought power through ambition, but had been forced into leadership through tragedy, compelled to kill his own father when the previous vampire king had begun slaughtering innocent humans for sport. She saw the weight of centuries pressing down on him, the isolation of ruling creatures who respected only strength and feared only greater strength, the careful balance he maintained between the supernatural world and human society that kept both sides from open warfare. As the night wore on and her connection to Kieran's memories grew stronger, Elena began to understand the true scope of what they were facing, the ancient prejudices and fears that drove vampire law, the political implications of their relationship that extended far beyond personal choice or individual happiness. She also began to experience physical changes that she could not explain, a heightened awareness of sounds and scents that should have been beyond human perception, a strange sensitivity to the emotions of the patients around her, a growing certainty that her encounter with Kieran's blood had altered her in ways that might be irreversible. When dawn approached and Kieran stirred in his bed, abandoning his pretense of unconsciousness for the few moments they could safely speak, Elena told him about her decision, about her refusal to accept Victoria's offer, about her determination to face whatever consequences might come from their forbidden bond. She had researched vampire law during her break, using the hospital's extensive medical library to access historical texts that most humans never saw, and had discovered references to an ancient ritual that could create a legitimate bond between vampire nobility and human mates, a dangerous ceremony that had not been attempted in over 2 centuries because the mortality rate for humans was nearly absolute. Kieran listened to her proposal with growing alarm, explaining that the bonding ritual she had found in those old texts was considered a form of suicide, that even vampires sometimes died in the attempt, that no human in recorded history had survived the process intact. But Elena had made her choice, had weighed the certainty of death at the hands of the Vampire Council against the slim possibility of survival through the bonding ritual, and had decided that even a desperate chance was better than passive surrender. As the sun rose and Kieran was forced to return to his feigned unconsciousness, Elena began making preparations for a ritual that might kill her, but represented their only hope of legitimizing their relationship under vampire law, knowing that she was about to risk everything for a love that most of the world would consider impossible. The abandoned chapel in St. Bartholomew's basement had been forgotten by most, its stained glass windows boarded over and pews gathering dust for decades. But the old stone walls still held traces of sacred power that made it perfect for the ancient ritual Kieran described in whispered urgency as they descended the narrow stairs. Elena's hands trembled as she carried the ceremonial blade he had procured from his hidden cache, a weapon older than the hospital itself, forged in times when vampires and humans knew each other's true natures and feared them accordingly. The air below was thick with the scent of old incense and something else, something metallic and sharp that made her teeth ache, and when Kieran lit the candles arranged in intricate patterns around the altar, their flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their light source. He explained the bonding ritual with clinical precision, how their blood would mingle in specific proportions, how the ancient words would bind their souls across the species divide, how she would gain some of his immortal strength while he would be anchored by her humanity. Elena listened with growing dread as he detailed the risks, the possibility of madness, of death, of transformation into something neither human nor vampire, but caught forever between worlds. Yet she also heard the desperate hope in his voice, the 800-year-old longing for connection that had driven him to this desperate gambit. The ritual circle was drawn in salt mixed with herbs whose names she couldn't pronounce, their bitter scent making her eyes water as Kieran began the incantation in a language that predated Latin, words that seemed to vibrate through the stone floor and into her bones. She pressed the blade to her palm as instructed, watching crimson well up and drip into the ancient chalice that had seen countless ceremonies over the centuries. And when Kieran added his own blood to the mixture, the liquid began to glow with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. But the moment Elena raised the chalice to her lips, something went catastrophically wrong. The mixture tasted of copper and lightning, burning her throat as it went down, and instead of the warm, spreading sensation Kieran had described, she felt something inside her blood respond with violent rejection to his vampiric essence. The candles flared so bright they scorched the ceiling, and Kieran fell to his knees with a sound of agony that echoed off the stone walls like a scream torn from the depths of hell itself. His pale skin flushed with color for the first time since she had known him, and Elena watched in horror and fascination as his supernatural stillness gave way to the rapid rise and fall of breathing, the visible pulse at his throat, the tremor in his hands that spoke of mortality suddenly restored. She reached for him as he collapsed forward, and beneath her fingers his skin was warm, truly warm, with blood flowing beneath it in patterns she could feel through her medical training. His eyes, when he looked up at her, were no longer the predatory black of a vampire, but the deep brown of a human man, wide with confusion and something approaching terror, as sensations he had forgotten for 8 centuries crashed back into his consciousness. The hunger for blood was gone, replaced by an emptiness in his stomach that demanded food, actual food, and the supernatural senses that had made him apex predator were reduced to merely human perception. Elena helped him to his feet, marveling at how he stumbled like someone learning to walk again, and realized with growing horror that her blood hadn't created a mate bond at all, but had stripped away his vampiric nature entirely, leaving him as human as any patient in the wards above. The implications crashed over her like a tsunami as she understood what this meant, what she had unknowingly become. Her blood wasn't just compatible with vampires, it was their antithesis, capable of reversing centuries of supernatural transformation and restoring the humanity they had lost or traded away. In the supernatural world, she wasn't just Elena Rivera anymore, but something infinitely more valuable and dangerous than any weapon ever forged. Even as she supported Kieran's weight and felt his heart beating against her chest, she could sense changes rippling outward from the basement chapel. Supernatural communication networks carrying news of what had happened at unprecedented speed. Above them, the hospital's carefully maintained neutrality was about to be shattered as every supernatural faction in existence learned that the cure they had sought for centuries was walking among them in the form of a night shift nurse who had stumbled into power beyond imagining. The first sign of what was coming arrived within hours, as Victoria Thorne appeared in the hospital lobby with a team of vampire enforcers, whose presence made the fluorescent lights dim and the security cameras malfunction. But she was not alone. Elena watched from the security office monitors as werewolves in human form took positions around the hospital perimeter, their movements coordinated with military precision, while figures in dark robes gathered in the parking garage with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Dr. Webb activated protocols Elena hadn't known existed, speaking rapid commands into hidden communication devices as barriers of blessed silver emerged from concealed panels in the walls, and ancient protective wards blazed to life throughout the building. He explained in clipped sentences that St. Bartholomew's had always been more than a hospital, serving as neutral ground between supernatural factions for over a century, and the restricted wing where Elena had worked was designed specifically to contain beings whose very presence could destabilize reality. The werewolf clans wanted Elena's blood to cure their members who had been turned against their will. Desperate to escape the monthly agony of transformation and return to purely human existence, while the ancient witch covens saw her as a genetic anomaly whose DNA might unlock secrets of power they had spent lifetimes pursuing. Most terrifying were the demon hunters, humans who had dedicated their lives to eradicating supernatural threats and believed Elena represented the ultimate weapon in their crusade, capable of reducing the most powerful vampires to defenseless mortals before striking the killing blow. Elena and Kieran moved through the hospital's labyrinthine corridors like prey animals, staying ahead of hunting parties that could track them by scent, by supernatural senses, by methods she couldn't understand but could feel pressing against her mind like predatory intent made manifest. Kieran's temporary humanity had left him vulnerable but also strangely liberated, able to access memories his vampire nature had suppressed. And during a brief rest in an abandoned storage room, he told Elena about artifacts hidden throughout the city, relics of power that could shift the balance between the human and supernatural worlds. The most important was something called the Severance Stone, capable of permanently separating the two realms so that vampires, werewolves, and all the others would be banished to a parallel dimension where they could no longer affect human lives. Victoria found them anyway, materializing from shadows that shouldn't have existed in the brightly lit corridor, and Elena saw the ancient vampire's face change when she realized what Elena's blood had done to Kieran. There was hunger there. Desperate and immediate, not for Elena's death, but for the gift she represented, the chance to feel sunlight again without burning, to taste food and feel her heartbeat, and remember what it meant to be the human woman she had been before centuries of supernatural existence. But there was also calculation as Victoria realized the implications, understanding that Elena's power could destabilize every supernatural hierarchy, could reduce the most ancient and powerful creatures to defenseless mortals overnight if weaponized by the wrong hands. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Victoria's superhuman speed and strength against Kieran's desperate human determination to protect the woman he loved. But it ended when Elena stepped between them with her hands extended, offering her blood freely to Victoria in exchange for safe passage. The vampire elder recoiled, as if Elena had offered her poison, understanding instinctively that accepting such a gift would mean the end of everything she had built over centuries of careful accumulation of power and influence. As Kieran's temporary humanity began to fade, Elena felt the first stirrings of their psychic connection reasserting itself, bringing with it memories that weren't her own, visions of a man who had once been mortal, who had loved a woman named Isabel, and fathered children whose names he spoke like prayers. She saw his human death and vampiric rebirth, the centuries of struggle to maintain some vestige of the man he had been while wielding the power necessary to protect those he cared about, and understood finally that his greatest fear wasn't his own destruction, but the possibility of losing another love to the fundamental incompatibility between human fragility and supernatural permanence. The pain of his transformation back to vampiric nature was excruciating, his human nervous system rebelling against the return of predatory senses and the hunger for blood, and Elena realized she faced an impossible choice. She could use more of her blood to make his humanity permanent, but Dr. Webb's hasty medical scans suggested the process might kill her through supernatural feedback, leaving Kieran defenseless in a world where he had made countless enemies over 8 centuries of rule. Alternatively, she could allow his vampire nature to fully reassert itself, but their bond would make her a permanent target for every supernatural faction that wanted to control or destroy her unique abilities. The decision became more urgent when Elena discovered Dr. Webb's hidden files in his private office, medical records that revealed she wasn't the first human to manifest these abilities. 30 years earlier, a nurse named Sarah Chen had possessed similar blood properties, had successfully restored a vampire's humanity in a controlled experiment, but both Sarah and the vampire had vanished without explanation shortly afterward. The files hinted at a shadow organization, human authorities who had been monitoring and studying supernatural activity for generations. And Elena realized with growing dread that her abilities hadn't manifested randomly, but might have been the result of deliberate genetic manipulation spanning multiple generations. As Kieran's vampire nature completed its return, stronger than before, but fundamentally changed by his brief experience of renewed humanity, Elena understood that their love story was just the beginning of a much larger conflict that would determine the future relationship between her species and all the creatures that hunted in the darkness beyond human perception. Elena discovered the truth about Sarah Chen in the most mundane way possible, finding a misfiled patient record wedged behind a filing cabinet in Dr. Webb's office while searching for supplies during her break. The file was dated 30 years ago, marked with the same restricted access codes as Kieran's chart, and contained medical records for a nurse named Sarah Chen, who possessed what the documents clinically described as unique hematological properties and enhanced psychic resistance to supernatural influence. Sarah's blood work showed the same rare markers that Elena carried, the same genetic anomalies that Webb had claimed made her suitable for vampire care, but Sarah's file contained additional notes that made Elena's stomach turn cold with understanding. Laboratory reports detailed experiments conducted on Sarah's blood samples, documenting how her plasma could temporarily restore human emotions to vampires, how her genetic material showed unusual compatibility with supernatural physiology, how her psychological profile indicated the perfect combination of empathy and resilience needed for prolonged contact with predatory species. The final entry in Sarah's file was a brief note stating that both she and her vampire patient had disappeared from the hospital without explanation, their rooms found empty one morning with no sign of struggle or departure, as if they had simply ceased to exist. When Elena confronted Dr. Webb with Sarah's file, his carefully maintained professional facade cracked completely, revealing the calculating researcher beneath the compassionate physician mask he had worn for so long. He explained with scientific detachment that the hospital had been conducting covert research into human supernatural bonding for decades, funded by a shadow organization that sought to develop methods for controlling supernatural populations through carefully selected human agents. Elena's recruitment to St. Bartholomew's had been orchestrated from the beginning, her nursing school recommendations influenced by handlers who had been monitoring her blood work since childhood, her assignment to Kieran's care, the culmination of years of preparation designed to create the perfect test subject for their latest experiment. Webb revealed that Elena was not the first nurse with her unique abilities to be placed in supernatural care situations, that there had been dozens of others over the years, women and men carefully selected and positioned to study the effects of prolonged human supernatural contact. Most had been deemed failures when they showed no special response to supernatural influence, but a few, like Sarah and Elena, had demonstrated the remarkable ability to affect supernatural physiology through blood contact, making them invaluable research specimens for an organization that viewed supernatural creatures as threats to be contained rather than beings with rights to autonomous existence. Meanwhile, Kieran experienced his own profound changes as his vampire nature fully reasserted itself after the temporary humanity Elena's blood had triggered. The brief period of human sensation had left him fundamentally altered, able to feel emotions with an intensity that vampires were not designed to experience, vulnerable to empathy and compassion in ways that compromised the cold calculation that had kept him alive for 8 centuries. His enhanced emotional state created ripples through the vampire psychic network that connected all members of his bloodline, transmitting feelings of love and protectiveness and desperate longing to vampires who had forgotten such sensations existed. The Vampire Council detected these emotional contaminations immediately, recognizing them as evidence that their king had been compromised by human attachment in ways that threatened the species' carefully maintained psychological defenses. Victoria arrived at the hospital within hours of detecting Kieran's emotional instability, bringing with her a full council of vampire nobles who declared him unfit to rule and demanded immediate intervention to prevent his condition from spreading to other vampires who might be inspired to seek similar human connections. The council's declaration of Kieran's incompetence triggered a cascade of supernatural politics that Elena barely understood, as vampire houses that had spent centuries suppressing their ambitions suddenly saw opportunity in their king's perceived weakness. Dr. Webb chose that moment to reveal his true allegiance, activating a security protocol that sealed the restricted wing and summoned armed personnel from the Shadow Organization that had funded his research for so many years. Webb explained with clinical enthusiasm that Elena had exceeded all expectations as a test subject, that her ability to temporarily restore vampire humanity represented a breakthrough in supernatural control technology that his employers had been seeking for generations. He intended to transfer her to a proper research facility where her unique properties could be studied and replicated, where her blood could be harvested and synthesized to create a weapon capable of reducing any supernatural creature to helpless humanity. Elena found herself trapped between Webb's security forces and the approaching Vampire Council, both groups determined to control or eliminate her for their own purposes, when the hospital's other supernatural residents revealed themselves in ways she had never imagined. The night shift orderlies she had worked alongside for years transformed before her eyes into werewolves whose human disguises fell away like discarded clothing, their protective instincts triggered by the threat to someone they had come to consider pack family. The nursing staff from the pediatric ward revealed themselves as a coven of witches who had been using their positions to heal children through means that medical science could not explain, their magic turning the hospital corridors into a battlefield where reality bent according to their collective will. A security guard she barely knew sprouted wings and talons as he shifted into his true form as a gargoyle, while the soft-spoken pharmacist began weaving spells of confusion that sent Webb's armed personnel stumbling through doorways that led to different floors than they should have. The battle that erupted throughout St. Bartholomew's Hospital was unlike anything Elena could have imagined. Supernatural creatures fighting both to protect her and to settle old grievances with the Shadow Organization that had been hunting their kind for generations. During the chaos, Elena discovered that her abilities extended far beyond vampire restoration when she found herself surrounded by injured werewolves whose rage was consuming their ability to think clearly. Instinctively, she pressed her bleeding hands against their wounds and watched in amazement as her blood contact calmed their beast nature enough for them to regain human consciousness while retaining their supernatural strength. A witch who had been caught in crossfire between vampire and werewolf found her magic stabilizing when Elena's touch grounded the wild energies that were threatening to tear her apart from within. Even Victoria, who had come to the hospital as Elena's enemy, found herself fighting alongside Kieran when she realized that the Shadow Organization represented a threat to all supernatural autonomy, that their goal of controlling supernatural creatures through human agents would reduce her people to laboratory specimens and living weapons. Elena understood in that moment that she was not destined to be a weapon against supernatural creatures, but rather a bridge between species, someone whose unique biology could facilitate cooperation and understanding rather than domination and control. As the supernatural battle raged around them, Elena made the conscious choice to remain in the hospital rather than fleeing to safety, moving through the combat zones to offer healing to any creature who needed it, regardless of their species or faction. Her presence calming the ancient hatreds and territorial instincts that normally made cooperation impossible between werewolves and vampires, witches and gargoyles. The fighting finally ended when the Vampire Council arrived in overwhelming force, their combined presence so powerful that it compelled every other supernatural creature in the building to submit to their authority. Victoria and Marcus led a procession of vampire nobles through corridors still smoking from magical fire and werewolf claws, their faces grim with the knowledge that they faced a crisis that threatened the carefully maintained balance between the supernatural world and human society. The council declared an emergency tribunal to address the multiple violations of supernatural law that had occurred within the hospital, from Kieran's forbidden relationship with Elena, to the unauthorized research conducted by the Shadow Organization, to the exposure of supernatural secrets to human military personnel. The trial took place in the hospital's main lobby, hastily cleared of human patients and staff, and converted into a supernatural courtroom where centuries-old laws would determine the fate of everyone involved in the night's events. Elena watched in growing horror as formal charges were read against Kieran, accusations that his emotional compromise had contaminated the vampire psychic network and endangered the species by inspiring other vampires to question the prohibition against human relationships. The council presented evidence of his altered mental state, testimony from vampire nobles who reported unprecedented emotional experiences transmitted through their bloodline connection to their king, expert analysis of the psychological changes that made him unfit for the cold calculation required of vampire leadership. Victoria, despite her earlier cooperation in the battle against Webb's forces, resumed her role as prosecutor for the Vampire Council, arguing that Kieran's attachment to Elena represented an existential threat to vampire society that could only be resolved through the elimination of the human who had caused his compromise. The council offered Kieran a final judgment that Elena recognized as both mercy and cruelty. He could retain his crown and his position as vampire king if he personally executed Elena, proving his loyalty to vampire law over human attachment and demonstrating to the supernatural community that the ancient prohibitions remained inviolate. If he refused to kill Elena himself, both of them would be declared enemies of the vampire state, stripped of any protection or sanctuary, hunted by every vampire house until they were destroyed. As Elena listened to the formal recitation of vampire law, the archaic language of supernatural jurisprudence that dated back over a millennium, she remembered fragments of the legal texts she had studied in preparation for the bonding ritual that had gone so catastrophically wrong. Buried within the ceremonial pronouncements and ritualistic threats, she found reference to an ancient provision of vampire law that had not been invoked in centuries, a right that predated the current council's authority and drew its legitimacy from the foundational codes that had governed vampire society since its earliest nights. The right of champion allowed any human accused of crimes against vampire law to demand trial by combat, facing a vampire opponent in single battle to prove their worthiness through strength and courage, rather than submission to judgment by those who saw them as inherently inferior. Elena rose from her position among the tribunal's observers, her voice cutting through the formal proceedings as she invoked her right to face Victoria Thorne in combat, knowing that it represented her only chance to prove that her relationship with Kieran could strengthen, rather than weaken, the supernatural community, that her unique abilities made her valuable as an ally rather than dangerous as a threat. Elena's declaration of the right of champion sent ripples of shock through the assembled supernatural court. Ancient laws most had forgotten, suddenly thrust into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the hospital lobby. Victoria's pale features twisted with something between amusement and genuine surprise as she realized what Elena had just set in motion, while the Vampire Council exchanged glances that spoke of legal precedents not invoked for centuries. The ancient law was clear and absolute. Any human accused of crimes against vampire society could demand trial by combat, facing their primary accuser in single battle to determine their fate through strength and courage, rather than the judgment of those who viewed humans as inherently inferior. Victoria accepted the challenge with the formal words required by vampire tradition, her voice carrying the weight of ceremonial authority as she agreed to meet Elena in combat, knowing that victory would prove Elena unworthy of bonding with vampire royalty, while defeat would legitimize their relationship under laws older than any current member of the council. The hospital's underground parking garage was hastily converted into an arena, supernatural creatures using their abilities to clear space and establish boundaries, while representatives from multiple species gathered to witness a trial that would set precedent for future human-supernatural relations. Elena found herself standing in a circle marked with salt and blessed silver, armed only with her medical knowledge and determination, facing Victoria's centuries of combat experience and supernatural strength that could shatter concrete with a casual blow. The vampire elder moved with predatory grace that spoke of countless battles, her elegant appearance concealing muscles honed by 800 years of survival in a world where weakness meant death. But Elena noticed something in Victoria's eyes that went beyond professional calculation to something approaching personal curiosity. The combat began with Victoria testing Elena's defenses, probing attacks that could have killed a normal human, but were carefully calibrated to wound rather than destroy, as if the vampire was genuinely interested in discovering what made this particular human worthy of such devotion from her king. Elena's medical training served her well in reading Victoria's movements, understanding the anatomy of supernatural strength and speed, but she also began to notice something unexpected happening when Victoria's claws drew blood from her arms and shoulders. Each wound that Victoria inflicted seemed to affect the vampire as much as Elena, moments when the ancient creature's predatory focus wavered and something almost human flickered behind her eyes, as if Elena's blood was triggering memories and emotions that vampires were supposed to have forgotten. Victoria's attacks became less precise as the fight continued, her supernatural aggression tempered by growing confusion, as Elena's blood contact created windows of clarity where she remembered what it felt like to care about something beyond power and survival. The vampire began to falter not because of physical exhaustion, but because of emotional overwhelm. Centuries of suppressed feelings flooding back through the psychic connection that Elena's unique blood chemistry created. Elena realized that this combat was not truly about proving her physical worthiness, but about demonstrating that her gift represented healing rather than weakness, that her ability to restore emotional connection to supernatural creatures could strengthen rather than compromise their society. As the trial reached its climax, Elena made a choice that shocked every witness present, deliberately exposing herself to Victoria's killing blow while pressing her bleeding hands to the vampire's face, offering her blood freely, even knowing it would cost her life. The gesture was one of complete trust and sacrificial love, proving that Elena viewed even her enemy as worthy of healing, that her power came not from desire to control supernatural creatures, but from genuine compassion for their suffering. Victoria found herself frozen with claws inches from Elena's throat, tears she had not shed in centuries streaming down her pale cheeks as she experienced the full emotional impact of what Elena represented. Not a threat to vampire society, but a bridge back to the humanity they had lost in their transformation to predatory immortality. The ancient vampire called off the combat with words that carried the weight of formal judgment, declaring Elena worthy under the most sacred laws of vampire society. But even as she spoke, the building shook with explosions that announced the arrival of a very different threat. Dr. Webb's shadow organization had chosen this moment of supernatural gathering to launch their final assault on the hospital, using military-grade weapons and containment technology designed specifically to neutralize supernatural abilities. Armed personnel stormed through entrances that should have been sealed, firing weapons that dispersed silver dust to weaken vampires and electromagnetic pulses to disrupt magical abilities, while containment fields designed to trap supernatural creatures activated throughout the building. Elena realized in that moment that her true power had never been in her blood alone, but in her ability to inspire cooperation between species that had spent millennia as enemies, bringing together creatures whose natural instincts demanded territorial competition and transforming them into allies, united by common purpose. She found herself at the center of an unprecedented alliance as vampires fought alongside werewolves, witches coordinated spells with gargoyles, and even reformed demons who had been seeking redemption joined the defense of their sanctuary. The battle that erupted throughout St. Bartholomew's Hospital was a masterpiece of supernatural cooperation, centuries of mutual distrust set aside as creatures who had never worked together discovered they were far more powerful as allies than enemies. Elena coordinated the defense using her medical knowledge to identify weak points in the Shadow Organization's tactics and her unique blood to heal wounded defenders. Moving through combat zones that should have been impossible for a human to survive, while vampires and werewolves protected her from threats she could not handle alone. Kieran faced his own moment of choice during the fiercest fighting, when Elena found herself trapped by enemy fire, with only his vampire abilities standing between her and certain death. He could have embraced his supernatural nature fully, become the cold and calculating predator that vampire physiology demanded, using his centuries of combat experience to eliminate threats with ruthless efficiency. Instead, he chose to fight as Elena's equal partner, rather than her supernatural protector, maintaining the emotional vulnerability that made him stronger rather than weaker, proving that love enhanced rather than compromised his abilities. The combined supernatural forces not only repelled the Shadow Organization's assault, but systematically dismantled their operation, exposing decades of illegal research and human rights violations to authorities who could no longer deny the existence of the supernatural world. The battle's aftermath revealed classified documents detailing government programs designed to weaponize supernatural creatures, evidence of kidnappings and illegal experiments, proof of a conspiracy that had operated in shadow for generations. Elena watched with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow as Webb and his colleagues were led away in restraints, knowing that their defeat marked the end of an era when supernatural creatures could be treated as laboratory specimens rather than sentient beings with rights and dignity. The Vampire Council found itself in an unprecedented position following the night's events, forced to acknowledge that Elena's influence had made their society stronger rather than weaker, that the emotional connections she fostered had enhanced rather than compromised their abilities. Victoria, still reeling from her own restoration of human feeling, proposed a new law that would allow human-vampire bonds under carefully defined circumstances, creating a legal framework for relationships that had previously been forbidden absolutely. The other council members, having witnessed the power of supernatural cooperation during the battle, agreed to establish formal protocols for human integration into vampire society, recognizing that Elena and Kieran's relationship could serve as a template for future supernatural human cooperation. Elena and Kieran chose to step away from the political implications of their love story, refusing offers of power and position within the restructured supernatural hierarchy to focus on the healing work that had brought them together. Elena returned to nursing, but now in a completely transformed context, working in a new wing of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, specifically designed for supernatural patients who needed medical care that conventional human medicine could not provide. Her unique abilities allowed her to help creatures struggling with the psychological trauma of immortality, vampires who had forgotten how to feel anything beyond hunger, werewolves trapped by the beast within them, ancient beings whose minds had been damaged by centuries of existence they were never designed to endure. Kieran made the extraordinary decision to abdicate his throne in favor of Marcus, choosing mortality with Elena over eternal rule without her, understanding finally that true power came not from commanding others, but from choosing love despite the cost. The formal ceremony transferring vampire kingship to his brother was attended by representatives from multiple supernatural species, marking not just a change in leadership, but a fundamental shift in how the supernatural world understood the relationship between power and emotion, strength and vulnerability. 6 months after the battle that had rewritten the laws of two worlds, Elena found herself changing bandages on wounds that told a very different story than those she had tended during her first encounter with Kieran. The young vampire in her care had inflicted these injuries on himself, not as part of any deception, but from despair, the crushing weight of immortal existence in a world that offered little hope for emotional connection or meaningful purpose. Elena worked with gentle efficiency while Kieran watched from the doorway, both of them understanding that they had found their true calling, not in ruling or commanding, but in offering healing to creatures who had forgotten that healing was possible. The supernatural medical wing had become a beacon of hope for beings who had lived too long with pain. A place where vampires could remember what it felt like to hope, where werewolves could find balance between human and beast, where ancient creatures could discover that even immortal wounds could heal given enough time and care. Elena finished securing the young vampire's bandages and looked up to meet Kieran's eyes, seeing in them not the predatory darkness of their first meeting, but the warm brown of his human moments, understanding that their love had accomplished something neither had dared to dream. It had created a space where healing was possible for any creature brave enough to believe in second chances, where the barriers between species mattered less than the common need for compassion and connection that united all sentient beings regardless of their nature or origin. 6 months after the battle that had rewritten supernatural law, Elena moved through the corridors of St. Bartholomew's Hospital with the confidence of someone who had found her true calling. But these were not the same sterile hallways she had once walked in solitude. The Supernatural Rehabilitation Center she had established occupied an entire wing of the hospital, its rooms specially designed to accommodate the unique needs of immortal patients seeking healing from centuries of trauma and the psychological toll of endless existence. Her methods combined traditional medical knowledge with her unique ability to temporarily restore emotional balance in supernatural beings, creating treatment protocols that addressed not just physical wounds, but the deeper injuries that came from living too long without hope or connection. Each patient presented challenges that no medical textbook had ever covered: vampires who had forgotten how to feel anything beyond the hunger that drove them, werewolves whose human consciousness had been subsumed by the beast within them for so long they no longer remembered their own names, ancient witches whose minds had been fractured by centuries of wielding power beyond human comprehension. Elena approached each case with the same compassion she had once brought to her human patients, but now she understood that healing sometimes required her own blood as catalyst, careful doses that could restore emotional capacity without triggering the dangerous transformations that had marked her early encounters with Kieran. The young vampire she had been treating, David Chen, grandson of the nurse Sarah who had vanished 30 years earlier, showed remarkable progress under Elena's care, his self-inflicted wounds healing as he learned to process emotions he had thought lost forever when he was turned against his will by creatures who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient meal. Kieran had found his own purpose within the rehabilitation center, serving as counselor for vampires, seeking to reconnect with their humanity. His unique experience of temporary mortality, giving him insights that no other counselor could provide. His relationship with Elena had evolved from the desperate forbidden love of their early days into a true partnership built on shared purpose and mutual respect, two beings who had chosen to face the challenges of bridging human and supernatural worlds together rather than separately. The formal abdication of his vampire throne had freed him from centuries of political obligation, allowing him to explore aspects of himself that kingship had never permitted. But their blood bond meant he retained some enhanced abilities, even in his chosen mortality, strength, and healing, that made him uniquely qualified to help others navigate the transition between supernatural power and human vulnerability. Their work attracted attention from across the supernatural community, ancient creatures emerging from hiding places where they had waited centuries for someone who might understand their particular forms of suffering. A gargoyle who had been cursed to stone form for 300 years sought Elena's help in processing the trauma of watching the world change while trapped in immobility, while a selkie who had lost her sealskin to human thieves needed assistance reconciling her dual nature after its recent return. Each case taught Elena more about the vast diversity of supernatural experience, the countless ways that immortal beings could be wounded by existence that stretched far beyond human comprehension of time and consequence. Human authorities struggled to adapt to the new transparency that had emerged from their battle against the shadow organization. Government agencies scrambling to create policies for beings they had spent generations pretending did not exist. Elena found herself serving as an unofficial liaison between the supernatural community and human medical institutions, helping to establish protocols that respected both human law and supernatural autonomy, while ensuring that creatures seeking healing could receive care without fear of becoming research subjects or weapons in human conflicts. The integration process was far from smooth, marked by misunderstandings and cultural clashes that required constant negotiation, but Elena's reputation as someone who had chosen healing over control opened doors that might have remained closed to less trusted intermediaries. Victoria's transformation from enemy to ally had proven one of the most remarkable outcomes of their struggle. The ancient vampire embracing her restored emotional capacity with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone who had known her during her centuries of calculated coldness. As the new ruler of the Eastern Territories, Victoria had implemented progressive policies that allowed vampires greater freedom to explore human connections while maintaining the social structures necessary for their species' survival, creating a balanced approach that satisfied both traditionalists and those seeking change. Her visits to the rehabilitation center had become regular occurrences, not just for political consultation, but because she genuinely valued Elena's insights into the emotional challenges that vampires faced when rediscovering their capacity for feeling. Elena's pregnancy had been discovered during a routine medical examination that revealed anomalies in her blood work that went beyond her already unique genetic markers. The child she carried showed signs of inheriting her healing abilities, but with vampiric enhancements from Kieran's bloodline, creating possibilities that neither human nor vampire medicine had ever encountered. Dr. Webb's replacement, a human physician named Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had been carefully vetted for both competency and moral character, worked closely with supernatural healers to monitor Elena's pregnancy and ensure the safety of both mother and child. The baby's development proceeded normally in most respects, but prenatal testing revealed genetic patterns that suggested the child would be truly unique, potentially the first being to bridge human and vampire nature without the need for transformation or blood bonding. Victoria's official visit to discuss the implications of a human-vampire hybrid brought together representatives from multiple supernatural communities, all of whom understood that Elena's child could represent either unprecedented opportunity for species integration or dangerous unknown that might threaten the careful balance they had worked to establish. The meeting took place in the hospital's conference room, now equipped with supernatural-friendly amenities like UV-filtered windows and electromagnetic shielding, as leaders debated how to protect a child who would belong fully to neither human nor vampire society, but might serve as a bridge between both. Elena listened to their discussions with growing determination, understanding that her child's future would depend not on the fears or ambitions of supernatural politics, but on the foundation of love and acceptance that she and Kieran would provide. Elena's research into her own genetic anomaly, conducted with resources provided by the Reformed Supernatural Council, revealed disturbing evidence that her bloodline might be connected to an ancient supernatural plague that scholars had thought eradicated centuries ago. The plague had once threatened to destroy the barriers between human and supernatural consciousness, creating beings who were neither fully mortal nor properly immortal, but caught in agonizing transition that drove them to madness and violence. Elena's blood carried antibodies to this ancient contagion, suggesting that her ancestors had survived exposure and developed immunity that had been passed down through generations of careful genetic selection. The Shadow Organization's interest in her abilities now made more sense, as did the mysterious disappearances of others who had shared her unique characteristics. all part of a larger pattern of preparation for a threat that might soon emerge from the supernatural equivalent of dormancy. Elena's pregnancy took on additional significance, as her child might represent not just a bridge between species, but a living vaccine against a plague that could devastate both human and supernatural populations if allowed to spread unchecked. The story reached its conclusion on an evening when Elena and Kieran stood together in the rehabilitation center, watching their patients engage in activities that would have been impossible just months earlier. David Chen played chess with an elderly werewolf who had finally learned to maintain human form without constant struggle, while a group of young witches practiced healing magic under the supervision of a reformed demon who had discovered that teaching brought him more satisfaction than the centuries of mischief that had marked his previous existence. Elena reflected on how a single drop of blood had changed everything, leading her not just to love, but to a purpose she never could have imagined when she first began her nursing career, transforming her from someone who provided basic care to someone who facilitated profound healing between species that had spent millennia in conflict. The final scene mirrored the opening of their story, Elena checking on patients during her night shift. But now she moved between human and supernatural patients with equal compassion and competence. Her rounds included vampires learning to feel emotions they had thought lost forever, werewolves developing control over transformations that had once dominated their existence, witches recovering from magical burnout that had left them unable to access their abilities, and humans who had been affected by supernatural encounters and needed specialized care that conventional medicine could not provide. Kieran joined her as she completed her final patient check, and together they walked to the windows that looked out over the city, where humans and supernatural creatures were slowly learning to coexist in ways that previous generations had thought impossible. The sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and pink that Elena had learned to appreciate through Kieran's eyes, no longer a threat to vampire physiology, but a symbol of hope and renewal that marked the beginning of each new day in their transformed world. Elena's internal monologue as they watched the dawn reflected on how healing often required vulnerability, how the greatest transformations came not from strength, but from the courage to share wounds with others who might understand and help bear the weight of ancient pain. Their love story had been just the beginning of a new chapter for both their species, proof that connection was possible across any divide when approached with genuine compassion and respect for the complex realities of different forms of existence. The promise of Elena's title as the woman who had unknowingly treated the vampire king's wounds was fully satisfied, but the revelation had led not to destruction, but to transformation, healing, and a love that had literally rewritten the laws of two worlds, creating space for others to follow in their footsteps toward a future where healing mattered more than the accidents of birth or transformation that determined whether someone was human or supernatural.